Доброго вечора усім.
Good evening, dear fellow participants, those who joined us. And we are grateful for the opportunity to continue our talks about historical monologues. It's a follow-up of today's seminar that started in the morning, and it was caused by the research projects initiated by Paweł, Dobrosielski and Yevhen Zakharchenko about the public discourse based on social networks. We had a series of discussions with the colleagues how this project came to exist, what are the theoretical foundations it's based on, what are the initial, midterm and final conclusions we can draw. And today we will hear the follow-up of this story, maybe some showcases, some examples, some illustrations how historic parallels are related to the Second World War and Holocaust and the way they are present in today's public discourse in context of Russian-Ukrainian war. Before I introduce our guests, if need be, we have interpretation, simultaneous interpretation, because Paweł is going to present in English. If anybody needs to listen to Ukrainian interpretation, feel free to do so. I will survive the Nazis and will survive the Russians. The Second World War and Holocaust in the current Ukrainian discourse on the ongoing Russian invasion. That's the project that is based on 65,000 entries on textual and visual, harvested from entire Ukrainian language internet. Paweł and colleagues were working on it. Yevhen Dobrosielski, Paweł Dobrosielski is the researcher from Warsaw University, the Institute of Polish Culture. The researcher, culture and philosophy, gratitude, the translator from English. Yevhen Zakharchenko, associate professor at Karazin Kharkiv National University, lecturer, historian. These are the leaders and coordinators of this research project, and they will share more with you about the project itself. We have 40 to 45 minutes for the presentation, and as usual we will have question-answer session following that as a follow-up of the discussion. So Paweł, Yevhen, over to you. Thank you. Thank you, Taras. I will start off in Ukrainian. I'm grateful to the Center of Urban History for having me here. I'm grateful to everybody who came here and joined us online. I'm a Polish researcher. I learn Ukrainian, I take an intense course, but I don't speak Ukrainian as fluently as I would love to. Therefore, I will switch into English to present our project.
Okay, so this research project titled "I Survived the Nazis, I Will Survive the Russians: The Second World War and the Holocaust in the Current Ukrainian Discourse on the Ongoing Russian-Ukrainian War" is a research grant funded by the Foundation for Polish Science under the For Ukraine program. It will last. Well, it is ongoing. It's been ongoing since last year. It will still last for a few months, and today we would like to present to you some preliminary results. We would like to present to you our database and so on. Yevhen and me are leaders of the project, leader of the team of researchers. Apart from us, Vitaly Bobrov, Petr Dolhanov, Valeria Karpan and Marina Chrypun. And we would like to structure our today's talk in such a way that I'm going now to make a general overview of these projects and to talk about assumptions, to talk about methodologies, to talk about theory for a little bit. And then I'll give the floor to Yevhen, and he's going to show you a few examples of those historical analogies that we are studying. We are going to analyze them and interpret them together. And then to conclude, I will give some few final remarks on our preliminary conclusions and possible practical applications of the projects. So just to give a very vague, for now, overview of what we understand as comparisons or historical analogies made between in the Ukrainian public discourse between the Second World War and the current Russian invasion. So first and foremost, these are two neologisms known perhaps to all of you. So Putler and Rascism. These are direct analogies. Putler, a juxtaposition obviously of Putin and Hitler. And then Rascism, a notion that's been embedded in the Ukrainian public discourse for a few years now, and that pertains to a certain ideology, Russian ideology that combines Russism, whatever it is or whatever it may be, and Nazism. Then there are certain loan words, words that have been taken from the Second World War vocabulary, from the Second World War dictionary, and applied directly within the Ukrainian public discourse in the narratives on the ongoing invasion. Such examples are Gauleiter or Collaborant or Anschluss, for example. Then we have visual juxtapositions and different photographs, memes. Yevhen is going to talk more about that. And finally, some more, some simple, some more complex textual analogies. So, when we set out to research this topic, we wanted to ask our database, to ask our material, how is the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine narrated with the use of the Second World War and the Holocaust collective memory discourse? But we are also very much interested in the mutual influence that is present within these analogies. So how do the vocabulary and imagery of the Second World War and of the Holocaust impacts the narratives on the current Russian invasion? And conversely, how those analogies impact the memory of the Second World War and of the Holocaust in Ukraine, and commemorative practices, museum practices in education, and so on. So this mutual impact is our main research question. So while setting out to look for sources, to look for these analogies, we took up a position, I would say, of scavengers. So we were looking for varied manifestation of this textual, visual discourse on analogies, both bottom-up, both top-down, produced by official accounts, by President Zelensky, by different ministries and official institutions in the social media that compared the Second World War and the actual Russian invasion, but also various bottom-up manifestations made by so-called ordinary citizens, also anonymous accounts in Telegram or on Twitter, memes, collages, anecdotes, jokes, and so on. And here, well, one of our very important methodological inspiration was Raphael Samuel, a British historian, who wrote that history is a work of 1,000 different hands. Memory is the work of 1,000 different hands, and each and every one of us takes part in shaping, let's say, the memory landscape of the mnemonic landscapes of our collective memory. Secondly, we were searching only for existing sources. So we were searching only for those manifestations of this discourse that were made for other purpose than our research. So we didn't conduct any interviews, we didn't ask people about analogies or what do they think about such analogies. This is what social more of social sciences do. We as humanists study existing sources. Our theoretical umbrella paradigm is culture studies, discourse analysis, and a very important aspect for us is the non-judgmental analysis, meaning that we are not asking questions about whether it is right or wrong to compare this war to the Second World War, or whether these analogies are called for or uncalled for, or is it moral or immoral, or are there better or worse analogies. This is not what we are trying to establish. We are researching what is there and what people compare and to what end, let's say. As Taras introduced us, he mentioned that we do have 65,000 of those analogies. We have a database of 65,000 records, and this was possible thanks to a company called SoulTrender that specializes in automated data gathering from the internet. And we asked them to scan the whole Ukrainian internet, in Ukraine and in the Ukrainian language for those analogies. And the methodology that we applied is, you can see here, this is a table from one of the iterations of our negotiations with SoulTrender. We produced together with them a matrix of keywords. So on the left here you can see keywords pertaining to the Second World War. So Druga Światowa Wojna, Babin Jar, Auschwitz, Anschluss, Hitler, and so on. And at the top you can see keywords pertaining to the ongoing Russian invasion, Olenivka, Izium, Bucha, Mariupol, Putin, and so on. And through this, they were able to create a matrix of keywords and scan the whole Ukrainian internet for the co-occurrence of these words within a certain source. So it could be a tweet, or a YouTube comment, or a very long essay on a web page. We have data from all social media, including Telegram, including YouTube. We have data from all web portals, and the search span the first year of the war. So from the 24th of February 2022 until the 24th of February 2023. So we have this data at our disposal, and then we started, and we are still in the process of analyzing that quantitatively, as well as parallelly we are doing qualitative interpretation. Yevhen is going to talk more about that. So this data can be ordered obviously by pairs of co-occurring keywords, but also we can search the database for the most popular analogies, most popular authors, most popular media, shares, likes on social media, and so on and so forth. So we have this whole apparatus, let's say, connected to this database. On top of it, SoulTrender as a company, and this was done in 2023, so we talked about AI today a bit, so before the LLM boom. But SoulTrender developed their own AI algorithm and did what they call thematic analysis. So a certain AI algorithm prepared for us some interpretational clusters with thematic narratives that then we can take and refine, let's say, and edit qualitatively. For the qualitative part, we also select sources from this database according to different criteria. Most popular sources, also selection at random, or most representative sources, and so on and so forth, and we code them according to the principles of grounded theory. We code them in MaxQDA software, specialized software for coding, and on the basis of this coded material, we do a content analysis and then cultural studies interpretation. So as you can see, this is like a multifold methodological project. So this is the very general overview, the very general assumptions, methodological and theoretical assumptions. Now I give the floor to Yevhen. He will show some examples, he will talk, analyze, interpret, and then it will be me, but I think we should change places.
Change?
Yeah, because this is what's...
Maybe only... Окей. Як уже говорив Павел і...
As it has been mentioned by Paweł already, and we mentioned that there are 65,000 entries in databases that are interconnected through different keywords and through different semantic fields. Basically, we build the structure of semantic links between key notions. Majority of those notions are related to the discourse of the Second World War, Holocaust, Baben Yar, Auschwitz, concentration camps, ansatz groups, etc., and many, many more. If we are talking about specific topics, for example, regarding interpretation, a certain phenomenon of this project is that we continuously see but cannot define basic philosophic issues. What was first, an egg or a chicken? Because the intentions demonstrated by official discourse, by official publics, authors, the representative office of the President of Ukraine, the Ministry of Defense, tendentially they are similar to the posts and thoughts of simple users who are sharing their thoughts, reflecting on the events of 2022 regarding full-scale invasion. So they say that perverts started reiterations. Our cities that have been through horrible occupation, 80 years seem to be not enough to forget about it. We see the occupant again, and we have the second date of occupation in our history. For example, Mariupol, that's the third occupation. In 2 years of occupation, the Nazis killed 10,000 peaceful people. In 2 months of occupation, the Russian Federation killed 20,000 people. Basically, the text uses comparisons. In a decade after the Second World War, the darkness returned to Ukraine. The bloodshed reconstruction of Nazism was set in Ukraine. The fanatic following of this regime, its ideas, actions, words and symbols, the maniacal desire to replicate his atrocities and alibi. And here we can see the parallel between Hitler and Putin. So in some of the texts it's even more broadly presented. So to overcome his crimes and even overwork the teacher and move him from the Nazism arena. That was the speech of Volodymyr Zelensky of March the 8th, 2022. So March the 8th, that was the day when we commemorate the victory over Nazis, so it's even a dubious correlation. There are lots of publications that we studied from the Ministry of Defense, the President, the Cabinet of Ministers. They are not related to the memorial data of the Second World War, but they still appeal to certain episodes and the heritage of the Second World War. The 29th of September 2022, and we see the syntactic source that is compilated here. So on one side there is the text confirmation of such analogies. On the other hand, there is graphic work that has been done in order to compare such analogies. And our team, the team of our project who were studying the visual comparison, so they managed to draw the comparisons in the visual environment. It creates even more empathic effect. Commemorating Baben Yar victims, the world cannot say never again. So here we have this dubious appeal. The authors of the World Congress of Ukrainians appeal to the events of Baben Yar, and automatically they appeal to one of the important sacramental mottos of European culture and memory: never again. As long as the evil exists, the international community must join in all possible efforts to stop this evil and help Ukrainians win this war. So here we see some sort of collage. These are the images that were taken during the occupation of Kyiv, Nazi occupation of Kyiv of 1943, and the images of Bucha and Izum 2022. And even this comparison in the database, it's rich in such terms as concentration camps, mass murder, terror. They use these words constantly, and they even compare geographic locations such as Bucha, Mariupol, Irpin, Izum, etc. In such a way, the history of the Second World War with mass murder, with the crimes against humanity, implicitly is transferred to describe the events of the contemporary war. The mayor of Mariupol says, the mayor's office noted that the Nazis acted in the same way more than 75 years ago. They looted museums and took them to their homes. They racists are confidently repeating their path, but under a different flag and slogan. They brought never again back to our home. Different participants, so these are local self-governing bodies who are representative here. So in unison, they say the same. So it's difficult to say whether the local government supports this narrative because the representatives of government are actors of the politics, or whether this is the universal topic, toolkit and appeal to compare it with the narrative of the Second World War. After certain iterations in this database, after reading these texts, we can even talk about compiling sort of vocabulary or dictionary, a glossary of the war. And one of the basic hypotheses that we used as a foundation is about the motives. What were the motives to write such posts using these allegories or analogies, etc.? The events of February 2022, since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Russian Federation in Ukraine, they were so exclusive, they were so revolutionary, radical for Ukrainian community of 2022 that starting from the government representatives and finishing with ordinary users, people could not reflect these events and processes that were ongoing back then. And in order to describe these events, they needed the terms, the notions and categories that existed at the initial level, rudimentary level of the cultural memory of the Second World War. And all those things that the community had as their collective and cultural memory is very variable, very dispersed. But all this was used to describe the events that were relevant in February 22 and across the entire 22nd year. Here we see some paradoxal process. The glossary of the Second World War, certain patterns of the description of the Second World War and assessment of those events have been designed by Russian propaganda during the Soviet times based on the Soviet education, and they naturally naturally were converted into post-Soviet education, and through different agents of historical politics they were disseminated. But these patterns were also worked for reflection over aggression from the Russian Federation. Basically, the aggressor state that positioned itself as the treasurer and promoter of Soviet values, their actions were assessed using the categories that were created by the Soviet government itself when they were describing the Second World War. Basically, this ideological language was reversed. The next example. Oh, little did we know that our generation would witness the desecration of words that, as it turned out, hold true not for everyone. Zelensky explains, the slogan "Never Again" has acquired a different sounding for Ukrainians now, as if the night thrust between its two parts into the very core, thus dividing these words so that never is followed by the question mark never again. Today we see that certain constructs are used that derive from the Soviet paradigm. But concurrently there is the appeal to the European memory culture, where Holocaust was considered to be the biggest crime against humanity after the Second World War. And here we see some phenomenal mix that is created in this digital discourse to describe the events of the Second World War. Today we can no longer say never again, because this again has already befell our land. After 8 years of hybrid aggression, Russia launched a full-scale offensive on February the 24th, and the war with all its horrors continues to rage in our land. Never again. We are fighting for freedom again. We are on the good side again. We have defeated Nazism, and we will defeat racism. And here we can put the equation mark, the equal mark between the Russism, which appeals to everything that relates to Russian and fascists. But in order to define this political regime and their actions that exist in the Russian Federation, this word was used. This is the visual project of Andriy Yermolenko, very interesting and very representative. The author was trying to use textual inscriptions like speech bubbles in order to compare the analogues, and also he enhances this visual effect. Some of them are quite well-known phrases, for example Adolf Hitler on the tribune, and Vladimir Putin making his speech the image of swastika, and the elements on the Parliament of Norway on the right, and letters VZ with George ribbon colors. The author is trying to construct these analogies, appealing to the final solution of a Jewish issue following the Wannsee conference, but he also is talking about the final solution, ultimate solution of Ukrainian issue. So he makes the equation mark here, puts the equation mark here, leading us to thought that the mechanics of the mass murder of the Jewish people, and this was developed by the National Socialism, in the same way it was a genocide, and it was aimed at the mass murder of Ukrainians, which was caused by the Russian regime. This project continues, and we can see other options. So the children are next to their building that was destroyed by the Nazi bomb. And another picture, a child is standing in front of the building in Kyiv ruined by Russian missile. The children are sleeping in the underground station during the night air raid alerts, and same during the air raid warning, Ukrainian children are sleeping in Kyiv underground or in the shelter. Here in social networks, we saw that these pictures were taken most likely in Kharkiv or Kyiv underground. The children and dogs and adults were sleeping in the underground during air raid attacks overnight. The extermination of civilians by the Nazi occupants and the Bucha tragedy, Bucha slaughter, Bucha atrocities. So this is what the term the author uses in order to appeal to associations related to the slaughter. The mass grave in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp and the mass grave that were found of the family of Motyzhin mayor and her family. That was before Izum was liberated in the Kharkiv region, and there were some images that resembled even more the picture on the top when they found the mass murders in Izum forest, playing with symbolics and symbols. So the similarity between Hitler and Putin is played upon, and the use of certain symbols. To a certain degree, it's unknown why the letter Z was used at the beginning of the full-scale war. Nevertheless, Z, this is how swastika is converted into Z, and we show the evolution and some historical ties, both visual and symbolic, between Putin and Hitler. Never again, we are fighting for freedom again, we are on the good side again, we have defeated Nazism, we will defeat Rascism. During the academic part of the seminar, we were asked a question: what is the share of the heroic narrative and the tragic narrative in this database? Obviously, the majority will appeal to tragic episodes of the Second World War, and through the tragedy of the past, we will understand the tragedy of the current full-scale war. But parallel to that, we also see that the experience of participation of Ukrainians in anti-Hitler coalition and the victory over Nazism, it's a sort of bridge for organizations that represent the official authorities, and it invites certain optimism, because Ukrainians were a part of anti-Hitler coalition, and together we we defeated Nazism. But it also probably hits up this topic for international negotiation purposes, because we are together with international partners fighting in order to defeat Rascism, and there is definite parallel. Another interesting post that gives food for thought, shot again. So this is the title, and there are parentheses. Here is some collage between the Kyiv panoramic view, that's on the left. It's some sort of symbiosis of a few images of Baben Yar and mass murder in Baben Yar. It's a special place in Kyiv. It's a place about the people who were murdered. These were peaceful people who were innocently murdered during the Second World War. Teaching the collective memory politics and Holocaust, we need to mention that there was no memories of the fact that these were Jewish people. Mainly that was covered by the Russian memory politics, so they were talking about local people, civilians, people of Kyiv, people who lived in Baben Yar, etc. Here we appeal to Holocaust and the memory of Holocaust. On the other side, so they use some rudimentary approaches to representation that was just civilian population, so innocent people who were murdered by Hitler regime, and today they feel the same suffering from Putin regime, because there was another rocket hit of Baben Yar, and the victims of the Second World War were bothered again. Today is the day we commemorate the victims of Baben Yar, and we appeal to the history of Holocaust again. Here we draw comparison of the number of victims and the character of mass murder in 1941 during Nazi occupation and the events of Bucha, Izum, Mariupol. The first mass murder was performed by the fascists in 1941. 81 years ago, Nazis started ruthless terror by killing 100,000 of innocent people by ruining their lives, and today this crime is repeated again. Bucha, Izum and Mariupol saw the terrors again, and we commemorate the victims of Baben Yar from who were victimized by the Russian terror, Russian occupants. Definitely speechwriter worked here, so they were trying to construct this image. It's not a phenomenal exception, maybe it's one of the most well-balanced constructs, but it demonstrates the trend. It does not deviate from the common trend. The anniversary of Baben Yar, this is the work of Nikita Titov. Look at how the author is trying to mark the territories that are temporarily occupied or under the active hostilities, and he puts the equation mark between Baben Yar by expanding its borders geographically to the territory of the frontline active combat operations territories. By using patterns of the collective memory, our collective understanding of what Baben Yar was, the author appeals to the fact that Baben Yar is present everywhere where the occupational area of the Russian forces is physically located in 2022. 1941-2022. There is a dash in between as the period of time, the 81st anniversary in times of pain, Baben Yar. And look at the digit 1, it's like a rocket. There is this visual metaphor, and also these lines of the geographic map, so it resembles the explosion. So this is the official post of the National Memorial Park Baben Yar. not only political actors are using this comparison, but also the historical institutions, museums that do professional work when it comes to history and memory. This is the teacher of history, a very interesting post. She organized an event to commemorate the victims of Baben Yar tragedy. So this is the teacher's writing. So this person is definitely knowledgeable in history. Today is the Baben Yar Victims Memory Day, the tragedy of Ukrainians in Ukrainian land that became part of the tragedy of the entire mankind Holocaust. So basically at the level of digital discourse there is appropriation of Holocaust that belongs only to Ukrainian nation. On the other hand, maybe it's not the new appropriation, but on the other hand there is this comparison. In Skala Podilska school there was a series of events, Baben Yar, never forget. It's implemented as part of the project where the human rights end with the support of the Institute of Olga Lengel, blah blah blah. And the main protagonist is Anatoly Kuznetsov, 12 years of age, who was non-Ukrainian, who was the citizen of Kyiv, who witnessed those events. Later he wrote the book about those events. This book was written in Russian and it does not represent Ukrainian discourse as such. So here we can see certain mix, certain use of the elements of different layers of memory, but the main code, the main idea is present in the first two lines. So Baben Yar as a tragedy of Ukrainian nation in Ukrainian land, Ukrainian ground. Anniversary of Baben Yar 2022. This is the post of the chief commander. Today I had the honor to welcome the chief rabbi of Ukraine, Moshe Reuven Azmana. I received his blessings for the victory and the sincere words of support. Our people know what it is to fight for its survival, and this is nothing more but the fight for the fight of Ukrainian people for their survival and existence. In the day of Baben Yar memory, it's difficult to talk about its repetition in Mariupol, Bucha, Irpin, Izum. So as I said, we have 65,000 of entries. We can talk about the tragedy of Holocaust, the local places, toponyms. So there is equation mark between those terms and terms like Mariupol, Bucha, Irpin, Izum. So this war showed who is at the side of the good and who is the impersonation of the evil. Rabbi Moshe Reuven Azman makes it very clear that it's Russia who is the fascist state, but his authority weighs a lot in the current world. Today we can even compare it with the Israel. So another analogy, it might look controversial given different views on the situation. So Israel is the military state. We discussed the ideas of providing spiritual needs for our servicemen, and we are grateful for providing humanitarian aid and treating our wounded soldiers in Israel. And I believe that we will move
thank
on
you,
to
Yevhen. I'm not
intermediary
going to take
conclusions.
too much time to conclude, also because we are very much interested in your questions and your contributions and what do you have to say. Let me just present some very general intermediary interpretative conclusions that we are able to make, and perhaps sum up a bit of those things that Yevhen already said. So the central issue, the interpretational issue for us is the issue of identification. So as Yevhen was able to analyze how past roles are converted into present ones in, excuse my joke, in like a kind of a game of who is who, or who is identified with whom. So first and foremost, we can use the famous Hilberg's model of the Hilberg's triad of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders, and we can see within those examples, within those sources, those analogies, that Ukrainians identify themselves within it with the victims, but it is not very clear who the victims are. There can be Jews or civilians or innocents, yes, and so on. So these are different categories of victims, and there are also different categories of perpetrators. Obviously, Russians are the perpetrators, but there also can be monsters. They can be orcs. They can be worse than the Wehrmacht, or yes, worse than SS, fascist, Nazis. So there are very different notions. And each of those notions, both of the victims and of the perpetrators, send us to different vocabularies, different dictionaries, different areas of discourse. This is a very complex, let's say, imaginary here. And finally, within the Hilberg's triad, we've got the bystanders. And here, actually, this category, this identification is quite clear. This is the collective West. So these analogies are their main function, because they have, let's say, an outward function and an inward function. So they are directed at the same time at the West and to the Ukrainian public. And their function, when they are directed towards the West, is obviously a plea for solidarity, a cry for help, trying to identifying with the victims means the collective West, who is either helping or not helping enough, and watching the tragedy of the Ukrainian nation, is posited in the identification of a bystander from the Second World War, but predominantly from the Holocaust. And another function of those analogies that are directed towards the West is to convince the Western public of a certain decolonization process that is happening within Ukrainian collective memory. Yevhen also spoke a little bit about that. Those analogies aim at convincing the collective West that Ukraine not only is, but has always been a part of the collective West. This is a process of a very significant memory transformation within Ukrainian public discourse from Soviet memory to Western memory. So the identification with the victims is also the identification with the West. Through those analogies, the Ukrainian public discourse is trying to put itself in the heart of the Western narrative, and all those Soviet topoi that Yevhen mentioned, and all those Soviet vocabulary becomes repressed, and then it comes, as every repressed thing, it comes out in unexpected circumstances. This is a very interesting aspect of those analogies here. While when those analogies are directed inward towards the Ukrainian public, their function is also quite complex. They appeal to, they are emotional, they appeal to emotions, but also factual. They appeal at legitimizing the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian structures of power and institutions, and at the same time to delegitimize those structures of power of the enemy, of the Russians. There are call for action, call for mobilization, but also a certain way of working through the experience, through identification with collective memory. And they are also, as you could see, these analogies point, if you take them as a whole, they present a certain Manichaean vision of reality, or Manichaean vision of the world, meaning that Manichaean meaning that this is a final battle between good and evil. And what it entails is that once Ukraine prevails, once Ukraine wins the war, it is the ultimate victory of good versus evil. So there's this eschatological perspective, very strongly introduced here. And this eschatological perspective then comes down to historiography. So Ukraine winning the war with Russia means that finally we, as Europeans, or we as citizens of the world, can close the chapter of the Second World War. So that we can finally create a more just world, somehow amending the fact that the Second World War ended in an unfair peace and unfair terms for Eastern Europeans. Obviously, there are analogies are very interesting heuristic cognitive tools of interpreting reality, because obviously they point to similarities, and these are similarities that let's say take us to sense, that produce meanings. However, when studying analogies, it is very perhaps more important than to study similarities is to study differences. And obviously, we are doing that in our project. I'm not going to go into too much detail into that. What are the differences? Also, Yevhen spoke about it a bit between the Second World War and the actual Russian invasion. So, what I would call what are the differences on the ground. But what is also important here, let's say more methodologically, from the point of view of discourse analysis, is that those analogies omit crucial differences between new circulations of information, new media, new genres, new modes of representations, reactions. So all those, especially visual, but also textual juxtaposition, somehow forget the times are different. Again, pardon my job. And this brings me to one, let's say, to final remarks, is that every analogy as a heuristic tool enables us to utter new sense, to speak about some new meaning. However, it prevents us from seeing something that it obscures. Something comes to light when you're using an historical analogy, but something is obscured. And it can be obscured both in terms of the specificity of the current situation. So when you're making this historical analogy, you are not appreciating what is the specificity of the current war, the specificity of the current tragedy, the specificity of the current suffering, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, making those analogies impacts the collective memory discourse on the Second World War and on the Holocaust, and it blurs the specificity of the Second World War and especially of the Holocaust. This is what Yevhen pointed out to as well. There is a certain very important, very significant and very interesting, let's say, interrelation between the past, present and the future within these analogies. This is also a topic that we are researching. So it is the present that reminds us of the past, but also the vocabulary and the dictionaries and the imaginary of the past that informs us about the present. The present that makes us understand makes us understand the present, and at the same time, those analogies set a horizon for the future. So I talked about the Manichaean vision and about eschatology, but it sets out a more, let's say, historical one. So if the current war is like the Second World War, with analogy, it should end like the Second World War. So with the Nuremberg trials and with the Marshall Plan and with rebuilding and with all kinds of institutions and gestures and deeds that were there, that were present after the Second World War. So these were the general conclusions, and just to sum up, because this is obviously a research project, an academic project, but we would not like it to remain only, let's say, an exercise in academic proficiency. And we would like to, for it to have some possible practical applications, and I'm very interested if you see any possible practical applications, either in education or scientific research, or creation of an archive of those analogies. We have a database. We would like to transform this database into a publicly available archive. Perhaps it can impact communicative strategies, perhaps it can influence commemorative practices, or even, well, our ambitions are not that high, but perhaps even, you know, some decision-making processes, or act here as you know, as a tool of collective working through traumas. Okay, so I think that's it from us. We have exceeded our time, but we hope we didn't bore you
Дякую.
much.
Дякую. Дякую, Paweł.
Thank you, Paweł. Thank you, Yevhen. By listening to you, I kept thinking how these historic analogies related to the Second World War in the context of current war. So this is the huge mix of everything when we are talking about the analogies in the context of fight between the evil and the good, the analogies in context of the Second World War, that has to make our collective memory of the Second World War as part of this conditional West, not the East. At the same time, we have examples that Yevhen showed us when Baben Yar becomes a tragedy of the peaceful population. So this is the heritage of the Soviet narrative of Holocaust, or this is the tragedy of the Ukrainian nation, as it was mentioned by this school teacher from Kamenets-Podilsk. So basically this is the attempt to build the culture of memory as we have in the West, never again. On the second, on the other side, so this is the peaceful population that got killed in Baben Yar. Now we are trying to understand what are the historic analogies that could be productive, and it's definitely a challenge. So practically, I've been thinking what's happening in the head of those students, of that teacher who was preparing this exhibition, this event, this post. So what sort of knowledge they will have of the Second World War and the current war after this mixture of information? Do we have questions? Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. That's a colossal project that you are working on. I have a few questions and comments. Maybe you mentioned that in the first part of today's event. I would love to see whether we can draw the analogy with the data analysis with other extreme periods of the tragedy of the mankind. For example, Holodomor, the famine, which is one of the central topics. Historiography in its public discourse drives away from the victims, and we see the perpetrators, and now we see the discourse, the presence of discourse of those people who survived, or we call them survivors. can we see that in your data? Is it done conscientiously through different messages to the state authorities or public institutions, or maybe it will be done later on later stages, because now we see one stage and later we will see other images and plots. What is important to say to the audience? Maybe you will also comment the idea of resilient Ukrainian society. So can we analyze it now at this stage through your research and the data you're collecting? And as a researcher of Soviet history, I found it interesting or weird. I didn't hear about the presence of Soviet discourse. Do public authorities, public institutions work with them? Because this Rascism discourse actually drives the reflections away about the decommunization, the memory policy. Is it replaced for Rascism, or it's somewhere left aside? Because the discourse about Rascism can be transformed into the critical perception of Ukrainian colonial memory. Can we talk about decolonization, or it's too early to see such messages in the texts and images that you work with? And a very short comment about the practical application. I believe that a lot can be done, and it would be very interesting to involve linguists into your project. Linguists could analyze how these words are used and applied. I believe it would be very apt for them, because linguists work with language, with text. Since you have collected so much, it would definitely be pertinent to work with them, and relevant, of course.
So maybe I'll start, perhaps answer, well, these are not questions, these are comments, but perhaps make some remarks to your comments, and then maybe I would ask you to answer about the Soviet discourse that Irina asked about. So I absolutely agree with you when you say it's when it's presented in bulk like that, very trend, that it's a great mix-up of everything, like a melting pot in a way. And it really is when you look not only on selected representative examples, but on the bulk of the database. And I would say it's a kind of, how to put it, late postmodernism, discursive postmodernism in a way. So like it's like a free play of signifiers, so that everything is permitted in order to achieve an aim. Discursive aim or social aim, so then the use of any signifier is permitted, and mixing up, juxtaposing at least any signifier with any other, then it serves its rhetorical purpose. However, and this was the other part of your remark, what is the difference between a functional and dysfunctional analogy? Mm-hmm. And it is a very difficult question, and of course we are all thinking about those poor students. But there are two questions here within this opposition between functional and dysfunctional. The first one is, does an exemplary analogy achieve its aim? And this is something that we can study within this research. So we analyze the structure of the analogy, the imagery, what is its, let's say, internal purpose, and is it successful in conveying its internal purpose. But this is only one side of the coin. The second one is, what is social impact? We can call it functional, but it's going to be misunderstood. Or we can call it absolutely dysfunctional and senseless, meaningless, but it's going to have a very significant social impact. But we don't have, well, that's a very interesting question for further research. We don't have the tools for that, because then we should employ, induced sources, research, polls, interviews, and so on, in order to research how those analogies shape public opinion, and what do they do with, let's say, collective conscious and collective unconscious. It's a very interesting question and a very interesting, perhaps, idea for further research.
Дякую за запитання.
Thank you very much for your question. In the previous part, we were talking about the Red Army, and there was a question about that. I believe that we need to think more about this aspect. Do we work with Soviet discourse? It's difficult to answer this question without a doubt. According to me, it doesn't work, because broad-scale war, it opened the journey to cancelling of anything Soviet. And when we are talking about the practice of working with that, maybe it's not 100% correct. Either there is the total negativation and cancelling, or the practice of just forgetting. So we are just using classic example. On the other hand, if we are talking about Soviet discourse, what do we mean by Soviet discourse as such in this particular instance? There was a question from our Polish colleague about the memory and using the memories of the Soviet army, so that will be a different case. In this case, there is the entire complex of comparisons with the Red Army, the Golden September of 1939. So, and the analogy is that Soviet army came to liberate Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. So when Putin army actually pretends to be the liberator, but this is not working with the Soviet narrative as such. Soviet discourse is not relevant anymore, or not timely, as they love saying these days. We should not refer it in such a way. Moreover, there is blurring of focuses, because Ukrainians are not part of Red Army, but part of anti-Hitler coalition. Ukrainians defeated Nazism and not as part of Red Army. So the focus of the role of Red Army in the victory over Nazism, so that's different. On the other hand, if we are talking about Soviet and other extreme events, there is the case related to the semantic bush. So what's related to the Soviet army? There is similar bush what's related to Holodomor. Holodomor functions in context of description of occupational daily life. Scarcity of food, especially in small towns and villages. So it appeals to Holodomor constantly, continuously. Soviet government starved people, and occupational forces starved people too. So the scenes with the fire and explosive contamination of Ukrainian fields, again, there is the appeal that they are trying to inspire new Holodomor. So in such frameworks, the memory of Holodomor exists and is getting instrumentalized when we do this comparison. Decolonization, it's hard to say whether it's the issue. It could be an issue for a separate research for the future to find the elements of decolonization as such, or the search of this resilient long-term development. But I believe that now And back in 2022, so this is when we started collecting this data, it functioned as a totalitarian school of Soviet studies with very clear binary positions and with analogies where there was only black and white. And of course, the Soviet discourse was not studied. Maybe this discourse of comparing East and West can also be relevant, and it might also lead to the attempt to build this discourse. We also had a question about resilience, about this heroic narrative.
Most of those analogies are, let's say, portraying suffering. Crimes, genocide. However, and this is the bulk of those. However, there are also ones that pertain, for example, to heroic resistance. Again, the anti-Nazi coalition, but also the heroic resistance of ZSU. There are also such analogies praising civilians in the whole program of civilians supporting the army and supporting the everyday life. There are also ones that pertain to the hopes for the future. So rebuilding, so Marshall Plan, so Nuremberg trials, justice. Again, whenever there is a need, a call for something, there comes also, not only, but also this discourse of analogies, like, you know, Soflink an analogy in order to use it to achieve some aim, to achieve an effect. But first and foremost, yes, these are about suffering.
Я ще хотів продовження спочатку мого коментаря, а потім
As a follow-up to my comment and your comment about the social effect and the outcomes of this analogy, I wanted to ask more about that. Today, it had been mentioned in a few discussions and presentations, and your presentation right now also had a range of examples. And the way I understood it, it means that it's either deleting the understanding of the Second World War, or sort of manipulative or incorrect statements such as peaceful population or Ukrainian nation when it comes to the context of Babin Yar tragedy. So here we are talking about certain effects when we draw historic analogies. Because this historic analogy might hurt, might harm rather than help. I wanted to ask about those effects and the outcomes. Today we asked about multidirectional memory of Holberg and the example that he presents in his book, how the experience of Holocaust and memory of Holocaust and understanding what happened allows the post-Holocaust society in the United States to talk about the slavery and to find the language that would allow to talk about those other contexts and the past that could be traumatic and difficult for American society. That's another analogy, and in this case the analogy works in a very rudimentary way for the benefit. There was another example that was mentioned today. It's when we talk about full-scale invasion and talk to the international audience, we use the analogy of Anschluss, Czechoslovakia, invasion into Poland, attack of the Soviet Union, and Hitler never stopped. There were follow-up steps and the follow-up demonstrations of aggression to demonstrate that Putin is not going to stop. In this case, it's a very clear message what has to be the outcome. And the third example that Petro Dubhanov mentioned today. If you were not there, maybe it will be of interest to you. When historic analogy in a very specific family demonstration has the impact on private lives. The Jewish family in a small Volyn village in June 1941, when the Nazi Germany attacks Soviet Union, decides not to evacuate from that village because the father of that family, who was the head of the family, he remembered German occupation of the First World War, and he remembered that Germans were very nice to the local population, and they created the very positive impression. They made very positive impression, and this analogy with the First World War becomes fatal for this family because the family chooses not to evacuate, and only 2 children survived of that family during the Holocaust. So this analogy has fatal consequences. So my question now is the following: how these analogies that we draw in context of this war, the Second World War that you see in this data set, maybe you have some examples, maybe you can tell where these analogies can be productive, where they can be applied, where they can add to the social effect.
This is a very difficult question, you know. So maybe I'll start and then we'll finish. So the Michael Rothberg's multi-directional memory, it's a concept developed 2008, 2009. This was a very very important book, talked about and so on, and let's say it impacted memory studies as a discipline. However, I would say politically or socially or discursively, it proved to be a failed project. So Michael Rothberg advocated for this multi-directional memory of one memory of suffering being a vehicle for the other, and for all of us to advocate for each other, and for the fact that the public space is not a zero-sum game, and that we can actively, through analogies, create new means of representation and so on. Nothing like that happened in the, let's say, 15-20 years since the publication of the book and the development of this concept. However, I think that it doesn't mean that historical analogies are always counterproductive. However, and the second however, is that for sure they are inescapable. Perhaps this is an innate characteristic of our discourse and of our imaginary and of our thinking about the past, our historical thinking, to make analogies. Perhaps it is, perhaps we cannot escape that, and perhaps we have to ask about not about the function or the effect of the analogy, but perhaps we have to look at intentions then. If we are to judge, that's again, it was a very difficult question. It was what came to my mind. Maybe Yevhen has got something more.
Я згодний, що це є дуже складне і таке.
It's a very complex and multi-level question. On one hand, how relevant it is to compare history on the analogy between the Germans of the First World War and the Second World War with the contemporary historic analogies. Because the contemporary digital society and these analogies, they function in the framework of certain events: mass media, mass culture, memification, gamification of this knowledge, because we've seen Ukrposhta issuing a stamp and they make the allusion that the flag was erected in Ivan Zimi during the Second World War and on the Snake Island during this war. So we can see a lot of parallels when it comes to memes and other things. Whether we need to take this analogy as the guidelines, because it might lead to wrong solutions. On the other hand, what could be the benefit of these analogies? Because these analogies, as it has been aptly noted by the listeners, they appeal to the tragedy oftentimes, to the tragic emotions. And obviously, it's some sort of working with the memory, processing the memory that the society feels these days, trying to look back at the past. That's one thing. Second, these analogies can help explain our overseas partners the events that are happening here, using the categories that are understandable to our overseas partners, especially when we appeal, but we have to appeal in the right way. We cannot over appeal, because we need to use the system of valuable coordinates of our partners, and we have to offer them comprehensive examples that would be understandable to them, and in that case it will be beneficial. Probably that's all. But on the other hand, I remembered a quotation of this German classicist who loved writing big books. The history teaches us a lesson because they don't learn the lesson themselves, and we still keep doing it. Ivanka has a question. Thank you very much. It was a very fascinating presentation, fascinating day. I visited a series of events. My question will be about the gender perspective of these analogies. Are there any analogies with the gender-based violence or sexual crimes that were committed by the German army and Russian army? In your archive, can you draw any conclusions about that? And how this female perspective of war is present in those analogies? Because I remember of the book of Alexievich and Victoria Amelina that are different when it comes to perspectives of the women's overview of the war.
Whereas the feminist perspective is present, and I'm going to talk about that in a second, the very theme of sexual exploitation and of sexual crimes, I didn't. Have you encountered any analogy pertaining? I'm asking Valeria, Marina, my team members. I didn't encounter any direct reference within the analogy discourse to sexual exploitation. However, the feminist perspective is very important here, and actually women are the figures of resilience that you asked about within these analogies, and these are analogies done to the home front, let's say, the Second World War home front, both in Great Britain and in the United States, with women bearing the burden of running the country, literally, because the men were fighting, but obviously also the figures, women and children, the figures of escaping the country, becoming refugees and so on. These are also analogies within, let's say, the feminist perspective, and with these innocent civilians being targets. But perhaps I know that Valeria and Marina were researching this feminist perspective more, so maybe.
I will make a very short comment, because we worked both with text and visual materials. And what we noticed in coding segment, that was the comparison of visual materials and the postcards of the Second World War, including Western and American. Some images were sexualized, and Ukrainian contemporary sources offer interpretation through visual representation of similar compositions, but they probably presented less sexualized figures, and this is also the comment to the discussion of the prospects of decolonial discussion and decolonial criticism regarding the analogy. I believe that it is present, relevant to Western partners, and this is what we can say through the visual analogy and the criticism of the Second World War.
Я би сказав, що взагалі тут антропологічний
In general, this is anthropological discourse. It's a broader anthropological circumcision, but unfortunately it's weakly presented because this war of extremes unfortunately deletes this human or humanized nature. And these texts speak with very schematic amorphic construction because we compare Nazists, not women Nazi or men Nazi. So it's about the regime, it's about the structure. There are certain semantic bushes, Red Army, NKVS, Ukrainian Insurgent Army, Einsatzgroups, etc. So anthropological focus is scarce there, or these are mass victims. But I'm talking about texts. When it comes to visual images, I agree with you.
Сегменти, які стосуються феміністичної теми, якщо ми говоримо про материнство, також, але це якийсь більш традиційний.
До плакатів же ж.
But you were talking about the placards, about the postcards, because I was talking about text, not the visual images.
I would agree that this, when it comes to this is like either institutional memory or of mass groups of people, institutions, and if so it's not very much anthropological, as you said. So there are not women, men, and children specific, but rather I don't know, allegories, and then with yeah.
Я сподіваюсь, за результатами цієї дискусії.
I hope that the outcomes of this discussion will be useful and beneficial. I hope that the results will be published sometime soon, and we hope to have a chance to read this published work. It will be a great representation of what we discussed today, because that's academic discourse where we can learn more. The materials that you have, they also have great potential. You can work with it onwards. You also are thinking how you can apply this project, how you can work with those materials. With this, I will say thank you to all of you who came to join this event, who joined other events. Thank you, Paweł. Thank you, Yevhen. Thank you, Marina, Valeria. Thank you, everybody who contributed to this project, to this discussion, to this discourse, and have a nice, peaceful evening. That's the most important thing. Thank you very much. Thank you.